Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Mental Health Academy Fireside on the applications of neuroscience in clinical practice. My name is Pedro Gondim. I'm Mental Health Academy CEO and your host for this session. And joining me is Dr. Chad Luke. Chad, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
I'm well, Pedro. How are you?
Very good, very good. It's always nice to connect. It was nice to have a little chat before the session started. And I'm really looking forward to this. It's our second Fireside, and it's going to be very exciting. Now, for those of you that are live with us right now or watching this on demand who have not heard of Chad's work, including the many courses he has at Mental Health Academy, let me give you a little introduction. So Dr. Chad Luke is a well-established author, researcher, supervisor, educator, and clinical expert in the integration of neuroscience with mental health. He's an associate professor of counselor education at St. Bonaventure University in the United States. 5 of his 7 books address the process of applying neuroscience research in clinical practice, including Neuroscience for Counselors and Therapists, Integrating the Sciences of Mind and Brain, now in its second edition, and Applying Neuroscience to Counseling Children and Adolescents, a guide to brain-based experiential interventions, a book that was co-authored with Chris Schimmel. Dr. Luke has been a clinician for over 20 years, a clinical supervisor for 10 of those years, and a graduate professor for the past 12 years. He's a prolific scholar, authoring or co-authoring over 50 journal articles, books, and book chapters. Dr. Luke is also the author of Mental Health Academy's 45-hour credential course, Clinical Applications of Neuroscience, a very popular course globally among our learners. Luke, did I miss anything else that you'd like to add about your bio?
Oh, that's enough. I will say that the 8th book came out last month, so Substance Use and Neuroscience-informed Approach. So very excited about that process. But yeah, that's
awesome.
Enough.
We'll include some of these titles and links in our chat, so keep an eye on that. Now, quick overview of how this session is going to work before we get started, and this is relevant if it is your first Fireside that you're attending with us. It's a little bit different from our other learning educational sessions where we have a presentation. So firstly, we've prepared an array of questions for Dr. Luke, and we'll combine these with written questions submitted by our live attendees. So if you're live with us now, you can submit a question at any time using the Q&A tab in your Webinar Jam browser. You can also interact with your peers and our team via the chat function, so drop comments there. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Second thing is this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be mailed approximately 1 hour after the conclusion of the live webinar. So keep an eye on your inbox, and other email folders will send you a notification when the recording is ready to watch, which means you can watch it again and again for as long as you want. And finally, if you need any support during the presentation, including technical support, drop a message in the chat or email us. All right, Chad, this is it. We are going to start now our wonderful questioning exercise here. Warm up your brain, because I'm going to throw some neuroscience at you. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of the content, I want to learn a little bit more about your professional background and why you decided to become a mental health professional and researcher. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey? Because it's something that's always very interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, Pedro, of course, thanks for having me and for making time. And it's always really good to see you. And I'm just thrilled with the work you're doing, leading Mental Health Academy, and grateful to be a part of it. And I'm excited to see people joining us. So thanks everybody for being here. Let's see. Let's do the short version so that people don't log off in the middle of my description. So I think from early on, pretty overwhelmed with the condition of the world and the state of suffering that I experienced being around individuals, family, friends, community, and definitely feeling a sense of kind of powerlessness to know what to do to make sense of the world. You know, a lot of mental health folks are kind of psychologically minded. We really want to know what's going on sort of behind the curtain, behind the scenes of people's lives and experiences. And for a long time, I didn't really find satisfactory answers. So pursued the psychology degree after a couple of different career starts. Then that wasn't enough. So did the master's in counseling and really worked with some of the populations that really struggle a lot, substance use individuals, those in unhoused situations, children and youth who had been neglected or abused and ended up in drug treatment centers. And so I wanted to just continue my education, pursued the PhD, and that allowed me to really study and broaden my experience. And so a lot of clinical work with a lot of different populations, and wanted to just continue. And that's sort of led me to neuroscience. I still wasn't getting the kind of answers that were satisfactory to me. And I was also then starting to see increasingly clinicians feeling kind of worn out and sometimes burned out, and just really feeling like they were at kind of their wits' end with how to help folks, especially resistant, really stuck kind of situations. So neuroscience has really been kind of a bright spot in my development. So that's the short version. The long version includes my mom and a pet, and spare you all that.
That sounds very deep. Maybe we don't have time to cover that one today. We're going to have a follow-up session called On the Couch with Dr. Chad Luke.
That's right.
All right. Thanks so much for sharing that, Chad. With regards to neuroscience and focusing on the intersection of neuroscience and therapy, how did you come about that work, and what encouraged you to take more of a deeper dive in it?
Yeah, so like a lot of folks in my psychology program, we looked at brain and behavior, physiological psychology, and I just sort of ignited a little spark of interest on how, this might be really what's going on and how we can come to understand folks. And then the more I read and studied, and then again was training students in a counseling program, and then supervising folks who were just kind of feeling like they were running out of some options. Just kept reading and designed a course around this topic, and just one thing led to another, and couldn't find the kind of resources that I was hoping would all be kind of bound together in one accessible platform. And so ended up serendipitously running into a publisher that I'd done some work for, and brainstormed a book idea, and then that kind of took off, and it's all been kind of a roller coaster ride since then, of trying to put together the pieces in a way that really makes sense for clinicians. So that's why I'm so excited to get to talk about this. I feel like the more I talk about it and the more I study, the less competent I am to talk about it, because it just opens up all these different avenues of knowledge that one could pursue to try to get mastery. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point you make. When you're learning a field that's advancing so fast, and then you get AI involved in the middle of it soon, and then next thing you know, the more you know, the more you realize the little you know.
Yeah,
very good point. And Chad, we're already getting some really good questions here, by the way. So I'm gonna start introducing them very soon.
Great.
I wanted just to ask you another question. How does current neuroscience research inform your approach to mental health therapy?
Yeah, that's a good one. I probably will want to preface this by saying that regardless of the question, I don't know that I can ever give fully satisfactory responses in a brief amount of time. And so just sort of naming that as we start, because everything needs further elaboration to get the full context. And so a lot of times I feel a bit at a loss to be able to fully capture what people really care about when they ask some of these questions. So, but back to your question. So many of the responses you'll get from me tend to start with "it depends." It depends on what we mean when we talk about informing our approach and what neuroscience is. A lot of times we as clinicians are struggling to understand maybe the difference between like basic neuroscience, translational neuroscience, and clinical neuroscience. So basic being kind of in the lab, where studying individual neurons in animal models of humans. And then translational is really starting to bridge certain animals to more primates. And then clinical is where we start looking at, okay, how is that working in a clinic setting? And often those are in controlled kind of situations. So I think Eric Beeson and I did some work together on a chapter, and I think the simplest way I can put it is that in terms of informing my counseling and my clinical work, neuroscience it validates, it extends, and it informs. So I think it can feel really validating to our current theories and techniques and interventions. And I feel like that a lot of times folks want to know, how do I know if what I'm doing is working? And it's nice to see that there's some evidence there. I think it also then can extend, so we can go a little bit further in the theories and the techniques and kind of interventions that we're doing. And I think we're sort of in the phase of model building, where we're taking this and saying, okay, can we build from the ground up a neuroscience-based treatment practice? And I think there's yes and no there. So so there's a lot of different ways I can answer that, but I think for the sake of time, I'll just leave it there and we can follow up if that's okay.
Sure thing. And I want to just very quickly summarize, because I think this is how I understood it as well, and it's a good way to frame it. You're talking about how initially, the work with looking at the neuroscience and how that intersect with clinical practice was in a lot of cases was validating practices that therapists had been already implementing for decades, possibly centuries, mostly informally at that stage. But I remember this is something that Dr. Alan Ivey talked a lot about when he was, publishing work in this area as well, about the validation piece. But then as now you get more and more evidence, then you start thinking, okay, we validated some of the things that we're doing, but now we know even more about what works. And should we then look back at how we're doing things and then start recreating to be the most effective as possible in our approach, possibly by removing things that don't show as many results and focusing really on things like the Pareto principle, what is really working here according to neuroscience. Is that sort of where you're getting at?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's this whole trajectory of increasing our reliance on some of that foundational science to inform our practice. And here's I think the linchpin here is it's really hard to do research on clinical practice. There's just so many variables. And so when we can study some of the underlying mechanisms, we can have a kind of, there's a continuum of direct to indirect validation of that. And we're starting to see that, especially as it relates to the person of the clinician. Like what we do matters and how we do it matters. And it validates multiple theories, but there are ways to then extend that in how we really turn up the volume on our clinical practice. So yeah, I think that was a great summary.
And there are probably broader applications as well when it comes even to reducing stigma and just encouraging people to, look after their mental health. It's one way to say these things work, but we don't have any scientific evidence that they work. And it's another thing to say, if you do this, it's been demonstrated that will help you in this way. I think from a public psychoeducation point of view, the more science you have to demonstrate certain approaches or clinical applications, I think the easier it is to have discourse in the area, as people are used to that with, fields like medicine.
Right. Yeah.
Wonderful, Chad. Wonderful. Quick turnaround to a slightly related question, which is about ethical considerations. So what are some of the ethical considerations that arise when applying neuroscience findings to mental health therapy, particularly regarding privacy and consent? So they kind of links up with what I just talked about, especially with psychoeducation. but also, broadly with any therapeutic relationship. So do you want to comment a little bit on that to give people a bit of context?
Yeah, lots of opinions here. Some of our team's research has looked at concerns that the field has about integrating neuroscience and the ways we integrate it. And the field being like counseling and counselor education is one of the branches. We're speaking more generally here. I think the sort of the quality of the information is one of the biggest ethical concerns, because I think in a free market economy where novelty sells and innovation is really attractive, I think that there are a lot of things that maybe promise a little bit bigger outcomes than maybe the science supports. And so trying to be a good consumer of that, I think is pretty, it's kind of our growth edge as clinicians, as multiple professions represented by clinicians, folks who would take courses here. And so I think on the one hand, I mentioned basic science. I think on the one hand, you have folks who are kind of scared, intimidated, daunted by reading sort of this original basic. I mean, it takes me forever to get through one article when it's using acronyms and shop talk that I don't understand. That's on one side. And then on the other side, you have basically, if you look up neuroscience-based interventions on Google, any of the sponsored results can be kind of flashier oversimplifications of like, just do this therapy and it's gonna change your brain. And so I think we're really stuck as professionals trying to navigate this science that's really accurate but really dense and hard to translate, all the way to folks who are kind of conducting their own research as a part of a product development that they're working on to sell. So I think that's a big thing. And so when it comes to informed consent and really bringing clients into this work, we have to know we have to help inform them of what they're consenting to. And so in order for them to be informed, we need to be informed. You're seeing this a lot with alternative therapeutics around ketamine and psilocybin, MDMA. There's a lot of risks and a lot of things we don't know, even though there's some cool things that we do know. Anyway, that's not what this talk is about. But yeah, so I think we still have a lot to learn. It also turns out that just because you tell somebody that what's happening for them is rooted in their nervous system and the intention is to reduce stigma, it can actually rebound and have stigmatizing effects. There's a large body of literature that explores this. And so I think that's a really unfortunate, unintended consequence. I'm just trying to help you see it's not your fault. But then the research indicates that people are less likely to follow through on therapist interventions, which is not where we want to be, probably. So great question. Thanks for putting that out there. It's a good frame for what we're doing.
Thanks, Chad. Absolutely. And I'm gonna, since we're talking a little bit about informing, clients and the population in general, I'm gonna link up a couple of questions from Georgina here, and would like to know your thoughts with regards to how neuroscience can help us combat racism, misinformation, and disinformation. No matter how you define those, and we're not putting a political spin in these whatsoever. But how do you see the role of neuroscience-informed sort of approaches or communication supporting clients and the general population in that way?
Yeah, so I'm in the States, so this year everything's political, but I will refrain from politics. It sounds like there's some multiple dimensions to that question. So I want to give it the respect it deserves, even though there's a few layers to it. I think that there are some basic brain-based principles that we can operate from as clinicians that can help us understand kind of the course of bias and how to regulate it in ourselves and in our conduct with others. So, for example, our nervous system, our brain, tend to be very gullible. They'll believe anything we tell it, and so this is sort of a play on cognitive behavior therapy. But it is true that often we start with narratives and then look for evidence to support those narratives, and that's related to the second principle of how our nervous system works, and that is our nervous system prioritizes safety and survival over accuracy and over connection. So if there's room left, we'll connect, but really what we're trying to do is survive. And so it's a lot more. And so the third principle there is that our nervous system values efficiency over accuracy. So we've got safety and survival over connection and speed over accuracy. So we are designed to make snap judgments based on limited information for the sake of survival. What happens, though, is when we do this, we start treating those snap judgments as if they're based in reality when they're really just based in biology. And so I think neuroscience and the neuroscience of bias and in-group, out-group bias and stigma really informs how it's really hard to get away from the way we're biologically wired. And so what that means in working with others is you can't really fake being empathic or connected to people, even though there are beliefs out there. Some people behave as if they can fake it, but the other person's nervous system is always scanning for threats as well. And so I think once we know that, it opens the door for us to have maybe more candid conversations, more room for some grace toward ourselves, grace toward others, and again, hopefully move toward more transparency in our communication. So I think that's just one dimension of the question that was asked. So if there's another level that I need to address, I'm happy to circle back.
I think that's good, and I think that also illustrates the importance of, there are certain areas of knowledge that as a therapist is really important for you to be across, even if it's at a basic fundamental level. So one of these is neuroscience, precisely because of what you just said. Understanding some basic concepts of neuroscience, some rules and how the brain works, really informs a lot of things in other areas, including our own ability to maintain a certain perspective with clients and act in a way that serves their interest and not being overly biased, because you're always going to be biased to an extent, but you need to learn how to manage that and recognize that, and then recognize that in clients as well and others around you. And I think a similar other area of knowledge is addictions. There is a common misconception that, in order to really learn about addictions, you should be working with clients with addictions, and that's kind of a specialty areas. But if you don't have some fundamental knowledge of how addiction works, especially in the brain, then you can't recognize the difference between a mental health disorders and addiction, or how there is an interplay between those things. So there are really some areas, and I'll say addictions and neuroscience are two of those that are really fundamental, and understanding the fundamentals of it really help you develop a more informed perspective across, any client you work with, or across any area that you're going to specialize in.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is so. If I can just jump back to this idea that neuroscience validates our existing theories. Knowing how the nervous system functions, we can be better equipped to walk within the experience of the individual rather than using the cognitive and social shortcuts that often we use to be more, again, efficient. Remember, we're biased toward efficiency and survival, and when we, as a society, we have to make these shortcuts to be able to scan the environment really quickly for threats. But when we're in session with clients, we have to make that transition that there is not a threat present in the same way as maybe if we encountered someone out in the world outside of the session. And that means that we can be more patient and take more time to explore with them their experience of a phenomenon and lay aside some of the shortcuts that we would normally have. And the research is pretty clear about addiction stigma and how even professionals who believe in the medical model, who believe that this is an organic issue, can still have high levels of bias and stigma and low levels of empathy, even when they know the science. So anyway, yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that. We can talk more about that too.
Yeah, we do. We have a question about that. If we get to that, we'll go a bit deeper. But just before we get to that, I want to circle around back to some of the questions from the audience. And this next question is about mirror neurons, and it's just a question: what is the state of play of mirror neurons these days? Which I guess it could be also paraphrased to, is there any new research or anything that's come across in recent years that discuss the impact of mirror neurons in therapeutic relationship or clinical sessions, and anything that's relevant for practitioners to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, and there's a lot of noise around mirror neurons. We typically now call it the mirror system or the mirror neuron system because it's not really like a handful of neurons that do this thing, but it's the importance of the research today, I think, is that we're learning more from at a biological basis how we form mental simulations related to someone else's experience. So if we're sitting here and I scratch my nose and Peter goes, and then starts scratching your nose, you first had to create a mental simulation of what I was doing, and then compared it to your own experience of what was happening. And so now what comes next is the story you tell yourself. So either you tell yourself a story, oh, Chad's scratching his nose, or, depending on your knowledge of me, you might say, oh, he's picking his nose. Or you might say, he's trying to subtly tell me that there's something on my nose, right? So there's not just the mental simulation, there's a story that we tell ourselves about that simulation. And the story is informed by our experience, where we say, when I'm in situations and I do this, this is what is true for me. The issue is then we can go the next step and project that back onto the other person and say, oh, that's what that must have meant for them. And so this mirror neuron system is really amazing, especially when we're talking about culture, ethical practice, and effective practice. Because I know that there are certain things. So let's use a less silly example of scratch your nose. Maybe it's this gesture. So in certain contexts, I'm waving hello, and in certain contexts, I'm trying to get your attention, and then maybe in other, I'm trying to warn you of something, right? So there's a few different ways that the context will tell you, at least make a guess of what that means, and it has to do with our relationship with one another. And so the mirror neuron system is helping us create those simulations and then compare it to the stories that we've told ourselves based on our experience, and then try to imagine which of those best fits the intention of the person that initially is doing the waving. I hope I'm not making too much word salad out of that. But it helps us determine what action we need to take in relation to that other person by trying to form these simulations. The problem is, if we're coming from a background of trauma or neglect or other kinds of harm, or situations that haven't promoted our own development, we can project onto others stories that are not their stories. They're our stories that we anticipate belong to them. And this really conflicts with what the neuroscience folks call theory of mind, which is how can I have an awareness of my experience when I'm with you and still maintain that my experience is about me, not about you. And so it's where training in empathy really comes in. So anyway, I'm sort of prattling on, and I'll just stop there for a second in case there's clarification or move on.
Well, I guess that highlights the importance of always doing trauma assessment with any client, as a starting point, oftentimes, just to make sure that you have a broader understanding of what narratives they may have influencing the communication and influencing their behavior and the expectations and so on.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's also true for us to be trauma aware for ourselves as clinicians. So what stuff is popping up for us that we may be diagnosing in our clients that is maybe something that I'm dealing with myself. Again, neuroscience is just bringing wave after wave of opportunities for humility as clinicians to continue to rethink how we work, why we work the way we do, and what we might want to change in order to be more effective and to operate with more integrity. And that's not an accusation ever, we're all figuring this out as we go through, but I think there's some really neat opportunities there to help us grow.
Yeah, absolutely. It also highlights the importance of your own self-narrative as a therapist, not to think that there's something wrong with you or that you're not good yet or not competent yet, or, we're talking about imposter syndrome before. But just to acknowledge that that is a process, that is a circular process that's going to keep going for your entire life. Not only as a therapist, but as a human being, but especially as a therapist. It's just part of the process is to be constantly revising your positions, looking at things without judgment, like you would do with your clients, and trying to refine how you interact with the world on a constant basis. The next question from Pete is about how you work with neuroscience encompass work with the body, somatics, and polyvagal theory and whole body integration. And if you can add any additional comments about that as well, about that field and those integrations, please feel free to.
Yeah. Well, lots of layers to that one as well. I'll say right off the bat that your polyvagal is a good example of kind of a self-contained model of neuroscience integration that is its own thing. And, Stephen Porges has done great theoretical work. Deb Dana has come along and really operationalized a lot more of the concepts and applied it in a clinical setting and has done some really good work there. And so I leave the depth of discussion to those experts. I think the question is amazing because what happens when we're talking about neuroscience is we tend to, at least the bulk of the writing that I've seen in the mental health spaces especially, is we're often just talking about the brain. And the brain is just part of the nervous system, and in particular, the central nervous system. But what we have to realize, I don't have a diagram here, but you have the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. But coming out from all of that is the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is then subdivided into body neurons and motor neurons, somatic neurons, and then further divided into autonomic nervous system, which is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So there's this whole part of the nervous system that is all about attunement to the body. And when we're just talking about the central nervous system, we're leaving out a lot of the sources of information that the brain and nervous system use to make sort of higher order decisions. And so all of the move toward, not all the move, but the flow of training and work in somatic sensory work and body work and breath work is, I think, a move in the right direction because it brings back into unity the body and the nervous system. They were never separate, but sometimes we treat them as separately. Popular book, Body Keeps the Score, Van der Kolk is good. It's also, I would go further, and the body is the first to know in many cases what is happening with the central nervous system or in the sympathetic nervous system even. And I mean, that's the key messenger is all those sympathetic processes are physical manifestations of what we might call anxiety or fear or depression. And so being able to tune into that, there are so many strategies now to help people learn about what's going on in their nervous system by understanding the early warning system that is the body. And so I think that's a really exciting way to do that. I think again, I want to underscore that approaches like sensory motor psychotherapy and polyvagal are sort of self-contained approaches. And so know that you can get fully trained on those. My work has focused in sort of more general integration across multiple different theories. But I will say the cool thing about polyvagal theory is it gets its name because the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it's the only one or only pair of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that exit the brain and go all the way down to the gut. All the others terminate at the beginning of the spinal cord. And so we talk about the gut-brain microbiome, and here's where we start thinking about the enteric nervous system and kind of how our gut health really informs our overall wellness. And so that's the cool thing about polyvagal theory. It just goes a lot more detail about how you treat someone and their vagal nerve dysfunction or collapse, as they might say. I have too many words.
No, Chad, that was great. Thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to jump into a bit of conversation about social determinant factors, and also next we'll talk about epigenetics a little bit, which is a very interesting field. But we'll start with the social stuff. So what role do social determinants of health play in the neuroscience of mental health, and how are these factors addressed in therapy?
Okay, too many words. So the model that I've been developing for like 12 years is not really that complicated, but it is grounded in both developmental psychopathology and social determinants of health. And all it means is that who we are today is the manifestation of all the social determinants in our history. So today I call it the inheritance model. It's gone by many names over the various iterations of my writing in understanding the research. But I'm going to say this as quickly as I can without leaving out too much of the important stuff. So our origin story, it begins with a sociocultural world that we're born into that we had no choice in joining, right? We didn't make those decisions. The culture was the culture, the society was the society. And in that, our cultural norms, societal norms, the period in history, the part of the planet we're born onto, the different economic forces and social issues, so forth. And in that context, our genetic blueprint is laid down. So we are given this sort of biological and hereditary inheritance, literally, that, again, will shape. You and I were talking about this a little bit at the beginning before we logged on, before others logged on, Pedro, about often we're born with the nervous system that we're born with, and that for me, that just means I'm pre-wired for anxiety, and you might be a lot more chill. But some of that is biological inheritance, as with health factors, like our health conditions that we're born with or not born with. And then the third is the early relationships. So we didn't choose our early caregivers, and yet they absolutely have a huge role to play in how our nervous system forms. Then we're born into specific environments, and more research is coming out on the deleterious effects to the nervous systems of individuals in exposed to environmental pollutants, dirty drinking water, air quality, other environmental toxins. And then the environment can also include the immediate environment, the intactness of the family or not. And then in that context, we have experiences, and these experiences shape how our nervous system is built. So what am I saying with all that? Good question. So in terms of thinking about social determinants of health, we have sort of these 5 stages of development in our early part of our life that form the foundation of our nervous system. And we didn't have any choice in any of those. And yet, at a certain point in our life, then we become responsible for living with that nervous system that was the result of somebody else's decisions. And so, for me, this is powerful because, as I mentioned to you a little bit before, I think step 1 is learning our nervous system, and step 2 is making peace with the nervous system that we inherited. And so this is just a drop in the bucket of the broader literature on social determinants of health. But I think when we start to have a more sophisticated understanding of the origin story of individuals, it makes sense how those precursors, those inherited features of experience, are manifested in thought patterns, feelings, behaviors, patterns of relating, and then general experiencing of the world. And so I think that where we're coming to with understanding the integration of neuroscience into clinical practice is a more complete picture of the individual that's sitting before us. So it's not about blaming our parents or our culture, and it's not about taking away the responsibility of the individual to live their life as fully as they can. But when we start connecting the dots, we have a lot of options for where we want to intervene in addressing some of those social determinants. Again, social determinants of health theory and practice is a lot richer than what I just described, but I wanted to give you a quick look at how I think about that today.
Now, that's a good overview. Thanks a lot, Chad. And I'm going to link that one up with our questions about epigenetics and how that influences mental health and what it means for therapy. And I'll just preface that question with a quick definition of epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So one example of this would be transgenerational trauma, and how that impacts behavior, and I guess that sensitivity that you're talking about in relation to how you're born and how your nervous system is wired. So do you have any comments about that, or some interesting insights with regards to how this information can be useful in clinical practice when working with clients, obviously clients that have a history of trauma they may not even be aware of because it might be in a previous generation, or they may be aware that it existed but not that it's affecting them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. As we think about using genograms or family trees to get further back in the origin story, like where some of the things that seem mysterious today that are popping up maybe popped up in the past. I like thinking about epigenetics as is really how the environment activates gene expression or leads to gene expression, which means things that were previously asleep are now awake, and now you've got to clean up after that. A parallel concept to epigenetics is experience-dependent plasticity, and all that means is that if the environment activates genes, experiences can activate nervous system adaptations. And so you have two forces acting on an individual that make modifications somewhat against their will And so I guess one of the ways to work with this in session is, again, so we'll go back to addictions. When I work in addictions treatment, I do a lot of talking about sort of how their origin story makes sense, that in many cases they couldn't be anything other than who they've become. And so there's a place for them to be kind of kind to themselves. But like the question that I ask is, what if your substance use disorder is not your fault, but it is now your responsibility? And it typically comes from, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, a bad joke. Two people walk into a bar, one walks out and the other has to be carried out. Like, it's really not a fair situation that two people go into a bar and have the same alcohol encounter, except genetically they have a very different encounter. And so I think I think there's a lot of rage in addiction treatment that some people can use recreationally and some people can't. And when they realize, that second group of people, when they realize that they can't, it's often feels too late, or at least for a certain period of time in their life. And I think that knowing that you inherited vulnerabilities that weren't apparent to you until you engaged in a certain type of behavior is a really upsetting experience to walk with people through. And I think it's an important one. So you see this also with physical trauma, people who might get in a car accident and it might unlock something that was there. We see this so often with PTSD that, statistically 10 people could go through the same experience and only a couple of them are going to walk away with meeting the criteria for PTSD. Well, what did they do wrong to make that happen? They didn't. They just inherited a vulnerability that they didn't know about until it happened. Again, multiple opportunities to extend grace to individuals, because, if you struggle with something and kicking the crap out of yourself for struggling with it was effective, fewer people would have kind of psychological issues because we're really good at beating ourselves up. I think I talked about that earlier too. So that's my little take on epigenetics. Again, just scratching the surface.
Thanks, Chad. From a neuroscientific perspective, what distinguishes effective from ineffective mental health therapies?
From a neuroscience perspective. Oh, okay. Let me think about how the best way to how to frame that one, because there's, again, lots of different ways that we can approach that.
Maybe we can start looking at some sort of neurobiological markers of therapeutic progress, I guess, and how they relate to client outcomes potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. That's good. Ultimately, what works is what works. And we still don't have a blood test to see if people who with generalized anxiety disorder are in fact experiencing relief other than their self-report. And so I think that and I don't know, so this is a US-led thing through the National Institute of Health, which is the research domain criteria, which is really doing the biomarkers research, full blast, put hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into this to try to assess multiple levels of explanation for behavior, so that we can, part of this is precision medicine, being able to offer directed therapies that are custom made for individuals. So that has an implication for what works. I think that many times, so this is something that I think is there's an opportunity to explore further. Sometimes people get better without knowing it. And because they're stuck in old patterns, old habits, and this is purely Hebb's rule, which is neurons that fire together, wire together, that the longer we've been thinking, feeling, acting, relating, and experiencing in similar ways, the more likely we are to continue, even in spite of contradictory evidence. And so I think as we develop better neurobiological assessments for understanding individual functioning, the better we will get at helping people track their progress. Because one of the things that the research domain criteria is really focused on is moving away from the ICD and the DSM, where we collect a cluster of symptoms, many of which are self-reported. And we know that we're not always that great at reporting out what's happening to us, or at least there's a lot of room for improvement. And so being able to move beyond that. And so they're looking at obviously biomarkers, and one primary is measuring cortisol in saliva, and then precursors to cortisol, and then also biomarkers of metabolites of cortisol. So one of the things that we want to be able to help people do is say, okay, physiologically, you are showing improvement. But again, the story that you're telling yourself is that you're not improving. And as clinicians, and a bunch of people around listening to this now, I think, can relate to making the observation, it seems like you're making some improvement, and clients disagreeing with that. And so I think having more objective measures of improvement data can really be encouraging to folks. So
that's a great point. Thank you for that. I've got a few more questions here. We're not going to have time to cover everything, but I just wanted your comments on a couple of approaches with regards to the neuroscience research that you were aware of. So the first one is EMDR, around research around that and its effectiveness and how it works at a neurobiological level. Do you know much about this field, and can you comment on it?
Yeah, so, well, I can say that I am not certified in EMDR. So I go ahead and put that caveat out. I think there are.
And sorry, Chad, just to clarify for those who are listening might not have heard, so EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is becoming more and more a popular approach for working with trauma, but many other conditions as well. But it's just to clarify for those that may have not heard this acronym before.
Yeah. So there are some strengths and some challenges with EMDR related to the research. The strengths are that there's a growing body of literature supporting the practice of EMDR in alleviating symptoms related to trauma and stress. The jury still seems to be out about the eye movement part. There's some really cool neuroscience research about what eye movements mean as they relate to their connection to the nervous system. Some have postulated that that the retina is actually part of the extended central nervous system, and so the movement of eyes are actually signaling neurobiological adjustments outside of the level of consciousness. That's pretty cool. Others are not convinced by the research that is an essential element. What I will say is that as the conversation around trauma has intensified, so has the level of reporting by clients and awareness in the media. So I think one of the things that's happening is people are saying, oh, wait, that is classified as trauma? I just thought that's how parents treated their kids, for example. When we think about ACEs score, adverse childhood experiences scores, And so I think when we see an increase in reporting of trauma, it can mean both that there's an increase in it happening, but also an increase in reporting because people didn't know that you could talk about this and that there were solutions and treatments available. So when that happens, though, I think therapists, clinicians have become overwhelmed with needing something that works for their clients. And one of the things that is really powerful about EMDR is it trains clinicians in a very systematic method of addressing trauma. When you do that, from the research, the research shows that when therapists operate from a coherent model that they believe in, their clients are more likely to believe in it and are more likely to follow through with the interventions prescribed. And so you have multiple levels of things going on. You have the systemic approach that is gaining traction. You have a belief by the therapist that this is going to be effective. You have a buy-in from the client. And then you have, no offense to any EMDR practitioners who don't like the word hypnosis, but you have sort of you introduce bilateral stimulation in a way that kind of bypasses the cognitive blocks people have to processing trauma. So essentially, remember, our brain prioritizes survival and then efficiency, and wants to survive as efficiently as possible. So when we start bringing up trauma memories, our conscious mind or cognitive mind puts the brakes on and says, that is not how we survive, and it's certainly not how we survive efficiently. So it puts the brakes on, and we are limited in our ability to work through that trauma. I'm giving you the broad strokes because there's a lot more going on here. When we can pair a relaxed state with exposure to trauma, the behaviorists have done this for decades, we can reduce the experience of the traumatic response. So if we can block the conscious brain from bailing out on us, if we can stop the emotional center of the nervous system from becoming dysregulated in the presence of traumatic re-experiencing, then we can think differently about, we have different ways of sorting that traumatic information. So that's kind of what's going on. So you have a lot of different factors happening simultaneously that really make it an effective form of treatment. But the exact mechanisms are still, I think, as my reading of the literature is that they're still a little bit opaque.
It's okay to be opaque. The exact mechanisms of anesthetics are also still a bit opaque after over 100 years. So don't worry. Those things sometimes can happen in science. As long as it's working, we don't need to necessarily know every single thing about it.
Yeah, I agree. That's right.
Wonderful stuff, Chad. The next question is, what are some neuroscience-based therapies for mental health disorders, and how do they differ from traditional therapies?
So again, it depends. There are the off-the-shelf kind of self-contained models that we mentioned earlier that are they have specific language around describing dysfunction, and practitioners are trained on that specific language and the mechanisms of change that operate within that frame. So, like, to be a CBT therapist, you have to understand all the CBT language and the mechanisms and be able to practice out of that model. Same is true for polyvagal, for example. More often than not, people are integrating at different levels. So the most common experience that I see is people using psychoeducation about neuroscience and about the nervous system to integrate into their practice. And speaking of opacity, one of the things that's really missing from brain-based psychoeducation or neuroscience-informed psychoeducation, or whatever you call it, is when it comes to psychoeducation, we as a field don't know what the appropriate dose is, like how much, how often, what kind, when, like when is the optimal amount, or when is the optimal time to introduce psychoeducation principles, and then how much. Sometimes we all might have been to a therapist or two that use psychoeducation for 45 minutes out of 50 in a session, and we would say that that's less than optimal. So psychoeducation is probably the most common in the research that we've done and others have done, is because when you ask people, what do you mean by integration? And we're telling people about their brain, teaching them about how their brain works. And I think it's definitely a sign of that's the starting point for where we are in the field, but I don't think it's where we want to ultimately land. So brain-based psychoeducation is probably the most common. There was another part of your question that I might have missed, or a nuance to it. Maybe not.
It was how it differs from traditional therapies. Neuroscience-based therapies, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm still more in the camp of what we talked about at the beginning, that neuroscience really enhances and can extend existing therapies. I'm not sure it reinvents the therapeutic wheel. And so in terms of differences, I don't think it should differ significantly from our tried and true thing. So I used to say, you're reading about neuroscience and you read a study that says that empathy really isn't that important to humans. You would not want to start integrating that into your therapy practice. And so, yeah, I think that we want to be really careful that we don't make it too different from our existing therapies. So then what's the value? I think the value is it does change, hopefully, first the clinician. It gives us a greater appreciation for what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how it works in the session. Again, it pulls back the curtain underlying, behind what we see on the surface as therapy and working. I think it can make us more empathic. I think it can make us more intentional, and I think it can make us more authentic. And again, that is understanding the mechanisms underlying what we do and why we do it. And I think we've really needed that as a field. It turns out that Freud got a lot of stuff right. Not necessarily the sexual stuff and some of his more outlandish claims, but he's been kind of roasted for the last 50 years for being out of touch. But neuroscience has come back around to really validate a lot of this. So I don't think it should be I'm either neuroscience informed or I'm not. I think that the science is the science, and we should all be science informed. And neuroscience is really I think the cutting edge of where therapy is going. So hopefully people don't say, oh, I'm going to be neuroscience informed, I'm going to do something totally different. Or that they think that they have to stop what they're doing to then somehow be more brain-based. I think it's minor tweaks here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. If anything, it just gives you a flashlight to point to a certain aspect of the therapeutic approach that you might want to focus with a specific client because of neuroscientific informed research or evidence and so on. This links up to, we're going to ask you two more questions before we wrap up because we're a little bit over time now, but I think these are important questions. And this next one links up quite well with this one, which is, can you discuss any emerging neuroscience research that could revolutionize mental health therapy?
Yeah, well, I think the programs like the research domain criteria, where we're looking at biomarkers, I think is going to be huge. Right now, mental health issues continue to be mysterious. And so I think that's going to be a big part. I think that the intersection of AI and neuroscience is going to be huge. It's pretty exciting to play around with ChatGPT and neuroscience related prompts and see where that takes us. I think that the intersection of the two are going to unlock possibilities in ways that we haven't really quite imagined yet, because there's going to be a lot of computing power that the human brain can't do on its own. That when we start recognizing, okay, so we have these neural systems and we're trying to figure out how they function, and there's a lot being written. One of the things that we talk about often is it's like impossible to keep current with neuroscience literature, and because it's thousands of pieces are published a day or a week in this area, and just don't have the capacity. So being able to harness the power of technology to understand the broad strokes of the research is going to be really helpful. I do think that we're going to see vast improvements in understanding trauma as it relates to how the nervous system functions. That's really my goal, is to understand how our nervous system functions in a practical way, so that we can make peace with it and make alterations. I think psychedelics are going to be a big thing. I mean, when we look at MDMA for PTSD and the ways that certain pharmacotherapeutics can induce a safe state while people can then reprocess. I mean, there's a lot of work left to be done. I think that's really going to be an exciting trend. I think sort of the dark side of AI that I really would love to mention as it relates to neuroscience is, as neuroscience is showing how important the real relationship, Freud talked about the real relationship, is in the therapeutic encounter. Increasingly, neuroscience is able to mimic the basics of counseling interactions. If you've ever interacted with a chatbot online, you know that this is increasingly. I talked to somebody at work today at my job who said, "Oh yeah, I used the little chatbot with our healthcare provider to see what kind of counselor I might need." And like, okay, so on the one hand, we have neuroscience really highlighting the importance of the relationship and some of these really human-to-human connections, and we have AI rapidly developing sort of simulated human response at a very basic level. And so I think that it's going to be really important for us as clinicians, as a mental health field, to innovate and really understand this science well, because we don't want to get in a situation where we're doing work that can be replicated by chatbots. I'm not suggesting anybody out there is doing that, but I think we can't just sit still. I think we really have to dive into this and be able to make a case for who we are as clinicians and why that type of work matters. Sort of a commercial.
No, very good, Chad. Thank you for that. The last question is a quick one, and it's just with reference to, you've already mentioned that it's impossible to keep up on neuroscience research and findings and studies. But for those who want to stay informed as much as possible, do you have any recommendations for resources? I'll make two contributions here. So firstly, if you are interested in taking a deeper dive on this topic, by all means, take a look at our credential course, Clinical Applications of Neuroscience. It's a very comprehensive course that Chad developed, 45 hours in total, includes video lectures, includes readings, and it really takes a deep dive into his model and various steps and ways you can apply things into clinical work, whether you're a counselor, psychologist, social worker, etc. And secondly, in terms of staying up to date and getting sort of a digest of interesting research and how it relates to various mental health or general health issues, there is the Andrew Huberman's podcast, the Huberman Lab, which is, I think, last year was the most popular podcast on Apple, or at least one of the top two. So there are a lot of episodes in there where he talks to very renowned mental health experts, people like Paul Conti, on trauma and various others, and he digests a lot of the research on various mental health issues as well, a lot of the neuroscience-based. So it's a really well curated resource to stay in touch. And I think the last thing is, what recommendations you have, Chad? Do you have any podcast, books, or I guess books is not a great way to stay updated to the latest, but obviously our books are recommended as well, in addition to, and I'm going to include links to all of that. But is there any, Research Digest or newsletter or sign up that you keep that provides you with a good overview of what's going on and what are some areas of interest?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot. I'll just direct you to one way that you can know you're staying current. If you have Google search bar, which most people do, and go to Google Scholar, you can do a search based on keywords, but on the left-hand panel of that, you can click a box that says review articles. And so you'll see that you can refine your search. But what you really want to be able to find in the literature are review articles, meta-analyses, scoping reviews. These are articles that summarize a lot of the literature that's out there. So that's one way to keep current. I am a little bit nervous about science writers who take headlines from press releases from universities on single studies and make, it's really interesting research, but it's one study or set of studies. And so one of the ways you kind of can protect yourself against that is buying high quality textbooks. And what I mean by that is BEAR, BEAR, has a core neuroscience textbook that has really summarized a lot of the literature. Augustine and colleagues is another one on, I think it's neuroscience, exploring the brain. Is the BEAR article, and then the other one is just called Neuroscience. They just came out with a brand new edition. And so if you want to know what the thought leaders, the scientist leaders in this field think is the most important thing to immortalize in a textbook for the next 10 years, it's that. And so there are some ways to get some really credible sources. Be mindful of the stuff that you read that is really going to change the world in one study, because we love to feel optimistic and hopeful, and so we can be seduced by some of these big claims. So stick with the basics, and I think that's one way to really move our field forward, is stick with the basics.
Keep it to the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Very famous quote by no other than Shaquille O'Neal.
That's right. A great philosopher and giant.
A great philosopher. All right. Thank you so much. This has been very illuminating. I really appreciated your time. And for those that are with us live right now, just keep an eye on your emails. We're going to prepare the video recording and make it available as soon as possible and shoot you a link as soon as it's ready. And make sure you check out Chad's resources. I've put some links here to his website. And we're also going to share some links in the email that we're going to send you, including his credential course with MHA. Chad, have a great evening. I look forward to connecting you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Have a good night, everyone, or good day.